our awesome series, Our Future on the Ballot, where we talk with interesting new candidates from across the country to find out what they stand for, what they don't, and what they hope to do if elected in 5 days. Wow. So today we are very excited to be joined by Fatima Iqbal-Zubair, who is running for state assembly in California's 64th district, which includes South Los Angeles. Now, before running, Fatima was a public school teacher who taught chemistry and engineering in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. She is facing incumbent Democratic State Representative Mike Gibson in the upcoming November election, after both advanced from the March primary. Fatima, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
So let's talk robots. It's very rare that I get
Yes.
to open a conversation with let's talk robots. I'm very excited to do that.
Me
So
too. I've actually not been asked this question first, and I love it. I
oh,
love it.
good,
Ask me
good.
about it.
Who out there is interviewing people who've worked on robots and not starting with
Right.
the robots?
Oh,
That's
thank you so
ludicrous.
much. Yes.
So you created a robotics program for the students in your school. And I'm hoping you could tell us, I mean, obviously like what the coolest robot that you built or that they built was, but also how increasing exposure to engineering programs helped your students.
Yeah, thank you so much again for starting off with that question. It's something I'm so passionate about, and I would even say it's one of the, what we created, what my students and what the inspiration we all felt from it is part of what propelled me to run for office. So it's such a big part of my journey, my personal journey. Um, so basically, I started this team in my second year. I knew from the beginning I wanted to teach in a community like Watts. Watts is just such a cultural powerhouse of a community in terms of the history, the art. I mean, it's such a wonderful community that you don't really see on the news, those sides of the news, right? You see kind of one side of Watts and Compton and things like that, which has really disappointed me. And so I knew I wanted to create this team in my second year, simply because what we all know is that there are a lack of resources, right, in low income communities, and it's a thing of privilege to have arts, to have engineering, to have all these things. And so I wanted to bring that opportunity to my kids because I knew from being in the classroom, like even my first year, that whatever you give, in trust, in respect, in love, is given back, just like with any relationship. And so my kids continued to inspire me in the classroom, and I knew they would just inspire me and impress me, in robotics as well. So this was an after school program that we started, and it was part of a larger program called First Robotics. Um, and it's like a worldwide international program. So essentially what it is, and our team was called the Terawatts, team 6904, the Terawatts. I just want to shout them, yeah, want to shout them out. The name was very well thought out, the first year we started the team. But yeah, the reason, part of the reason, let me start with this before I talk specifically about my team, why I wanted to start the team. It was a couple of things. I'll start with this. I'm a woman of color. I knew teaching in the classroom, when I taught, science department chair, when I taught chemistry, it was always the boys that raised their hands first. The girls were always more timid. And it's not, even if you take away, that's what I saw. That's what I saw objectively as a teacher. And so I had to, in the classroom, call on my girls when eventually they started raising their hand and speaking more. But I made it a point that I wanted this program, and I specifically wanted to, not to bash on our wonderful boys, but I wanted to, I wanted to recruit the girls in my class. And I made it very clear. I talked to them about equity in STEM. I talked to them about women leadership and what's lacking. I mean, these were conversations we had. And in fact, the first girl that joined the team, she said, I joined because Ms. Zubair told me that, girls don't usually go into building robots. And I wanted to, change that. And so that really inspired me, because she never told me that directly, but she shared that, in an interview. But so that's kind of why it was equity, in terms of women in STEM and women in leadership. And the other thing was also that, the fact economically too, Emily, looking at this, you know something like 80 to 90% of the jobs in the next decade are going to be in STEM, right? We think about climate change, we think about where technology is going, where coding is going, how our world is changing. A lot of the jobs are in tech, whether that requires a trade school education or a college degree. Tech is the way, our world is going, especially here with, in California with Silicon Valley, and with the innovative kind of industry we have here. So that was also my intention, is that, look, I want to prepare my kids. They already have a lot stacked against them. I want to really give them the best opportunity of being inspired, and getting the supports needed to go to school, to go to college. And also, to when they graduate college, not graduate student, without having a job, because a lot of millennials are experiencing that now. And
Mm.
and I'm happy to report that 100% of my kids got into a 4-year college. So a couple are in community because of, again, the cost, tuition cost, but they're all in college, and I'm so impressed by that.
100% is a
Yeah,
pretty impressive stat. I am
yeah,
not going to beat
yeah,
around that bush.
yeah,
So now you're translating this sort of hyper engaged, hyper constructive leadership into a bigger platform.
right.
And you mentioned your identity as a woman of color. You're in a district that is 90% people of color. Um, in the wake of George Floyd's killing, you
Yeah.
pointed out the fact that Black people, who are 9% of LA's population,
Hmm.
are a third of LA's homeless population.
Right.
So, how has structural racism impacted District 64?
So many ways. And Emily, this is very intersectional. It's not just in terms of police brutality, it's in terms of environmental racism. So looking specifically at District 64 now, as I talk about District 64, remember that this is a story of communities of color all across California, all over the nation. So District 64, is 90% Black and Latino, majority Latino population. Um, and in terms of our educational equity, let's start there. 54% only have high school degrees and 11.7% have college degrees, right? So that tells you how well they're set up as opposed to their peers in other communities to be competitive for the next set of jobs. And that's, to me, is a huge inequity. The other thing is that we have a quarter of the state's refineries, a quarter in, there's 80 assembly districts, and 25% are in our state, in our district, excuse me. We also have the highest rate of neighborhood oil drilling. We have the largest refinery on the West Coast. So, you talk about environmental racism. I mean, that is also existing in our district. And so now, I forgot to mention something with schools. You think, what's really important to me mentions the school to prison pipeline. A lot of our schools in our communities are also, very heavily policed, very heavily, there's this model of punishment that I simply think is not humane. I mean, I don't believe we need police at school. So that's another way. Something else is in housing. You mentioned, that was what you started with, talking about housing. Yes, so our housing eviction rates are 4 times that of LA County. And when we do look at the homeless population, by large amounts, it's happening everywhere, but it is disproportionately in terms of people of color. And now the last thing I want to mention is talking about COVID. We look at who's getting sick of COVID. Well, who's in these frontline jobs? Who has access to healthcare? Who is housed on the street, which is a public health crisis for them and for all of us, right? It's folks of color. And so this is not, some sort of liberal talking point. I mean, there's real evidence behind. I'm a science teacher, so
Mhm.
everything I say is always data-based and evidence-based. And if I wouldn't say it if it wasn't, but it is, it is evidenced by what we see, that we are seeing communities of color that are impacted, and in this intersectional way when you look at from environment, housing, education, all these different aspects.
Okay, so I want to walk you through each of the
Right,
issues you
right,
just brought up with stats and numbers because you're a science teacher, and I want to hear about your evidence based policy ideas.
right,
So let's start with the schools. Predominantly non white school districts, as we
mhm,
know, receive 20% less funding than white school
right.
districts. That's in California specifically. So, part of a $23 billion racial investment gap nationwide. What needs to happen in order to close that racial investment gap in California?
Yeah. I mean, in California, Emily, we have been one of the lowest in per pupil funding. I mean, it's been a disgrace. And we've had no problem funding, incarceration, funding, honestly, death row, which is wasting millions of dollars. So I don't want to hear from anyone, in politics that there is no money for kids. Because, I mean, if you hear me saying that, that just sounds like we're inhumane here in California. And I know that people aren't. And our government should reflect that. It's as simple as that. And so we have to become, the one of the top funders of public education. I want to right now, just highlight Prop 15. And talk about that as some, I encourage folks to vote yes on that, because that will, bring a lot of that needed funding. And Prop 15 is there because of, honestly, our legislators not stepping up to the plate. Also, since Prop 13, we actually used to have, Emily, some of the best schools in the world in California. If people remember that, we used to have some of the cheapest college costs, barely anything. And that a lot of this changed after Prop 13. And so we have a chance to, reinvest in our education. And I talk a lot about equitable funding.
Mhm.
I know I'm a woman of color, but I know, for example, that if I wanted right now to pay for my son to get a tutor, or if my son's autistic, I have insurance to kind of get him the therapy he needs, I can do that, right? There are many parents, many communities that don't have those resources or that can't access them. And so we have to think about, our points of privilege here as communities, as individuals, and say, look, this is not about bringing any community down, but we want every community to be equitable and to provide equitable funding, which means that we want everyone to be at the same level. That's all that means. You know,
Mhm.
and there are some communities, because of the historical, racism and oppression in this country, that is a real, very real part of our history, have been tracked to not have these great education system. And it's so sad, Emily. I mean, it is sad for me to say this, that you can predict, a child in a community. You can look at this child, a 3-year-old, and predict their chances of going to high school, predict their chances of graduating high school, predict their chance of going to college. And that is sad, that our kids have to be a statistic. It
Yeah.
should be that, you know what? If that kid works hard enough, they can do it. We don't have that in California. And if any state can really do that, our state has the most wealth. We have the most billionaires, we have the most corporations. We have a lot of wealth in the state. We just need to make sure it's spent on our children. I mean, it's as simple as that. And one last thing I want to emphasize is, from the time a child is born, as I mentioned, my son has autism. The first 5 years, medically, scientifically, are very important in a child's development. It's something like 85% of the brain is being developed. That first 5 years, in terms of our state funded pre K, should be fully funded. And right now, if you look at a parent able to take their child to private pre-K or daycare, the resources are a lot better, simply because, parents are paying. But our state funded pre-K needs to be adequately funded to match that level. And also, our schools, and then in terms of college, I really support tuition free college. I saw how much that lack of access really prevented my students from going. I mean, they can't afford to graduate with debt. Some of them were working full-time jobs while trying to manage a course load. And yeah, so I really believe in removing that barrier and making sure that they don't have to worry about the at least the tuition costs.
Okay, so we talked about the kids, and now I want to talk about
Mhm.
what their parents do, because I used to live in LA. I remember turning the corner and suddenly you're like in oil fields. You're on your way to the airport, and
Yes,
like suddenly you're
yes.
in an oil field, and it's
Right.
very surprising. Your district is, oh, okay.
Yeah.
This blew me away. Your district is home to a quarter
Hmm.
of the oil refineries in
Yes.
California. I had no
Yes.
idea. You've talked about saving the planet and achieving net zero
Hmm.
carbon emissions by 2030.
Hmm.
So, what is your plan to do that? And how are you going to save oil workers who lose their jobs in executing your plan?
Yes, great question. And I'm glad you brought the second part of the question. I always like, counter arguing the points that are given against environmental justice. What I'm going to say is not about losing jobs. It's actually about creating safer, unionized, good jobs for people. It's about not making sure we change anything until we have created the infrastructure, right, for something else. And the training is given so that a person doesn't lose even one paycheck, right? And so that's really important. So my plan for net zero carbon emissions, I mean, this could be an entire episode, I feel like, because there's so much we could talk about, but I'll just give kind of bullet points. To me, Emily, it starts with some essentials. Before we talk about emissions, let's talk about clean water. I mean, we don't have clean water in many communities across California. And it's simply because laws aren't implemented, local governments aren't held accountable in terms of following the code, changing the pipes we need to change. This is a simple infrastructure issue. And so that is something I want to prioritize, make sure that we have clean water all over our state. That's a basic right. Um, the other thing I want to talk about before I get to clean air, which has more I want to talk about, um, is access to clean food as well. And so this means it means more green space, it means more community gardens. It also means giving folks the ability to start a business in clean food. I mean, that's how we kind of can create jobs in the process. Now, in terms of clean air, there's a lot we need to do. Our state legislature wasn't able to pass a buffer between drilling. I don't know, Emily, if you've ever driven by homes where literally there's drilling right next to the home. I mean,
Yeah.
it's literally like 2 steps away. And I think that's just simply inhumane and ridiculous. And imagine the kids growing up there. I mean, they do have higher rates of asthma and cancer in communities like Wilmington, which is in my district. It is simply a disgrace. And so we need to create this buffer zone. That's all we're saying, create a buffer zone. So it's 2,500 feet away, from homes. And this will now make the water quality better. It will have less toxicity in terms of the kid, what they're breathing in terms of where they're playing in the soil. But eventually I want to get to a place where we can eliminate, neighborhood drilling. I mean, we shouldn't be having drillings anywhere near neighborhoods. We shouldn't be having fracking at all. Fracking is very dangerous. Fracking is not something we should be doing. I mean, it's increasing our dependence on oil. So that's something as part of my plan. Um, in terms of net zero emissions, there's a couple of things we can do to get there, right? Some of this is connected to how we transport ourselves from one place to another. A lot of our emissions have to do with people spending a lot of time, on the road, on the way to work, right? And so, creating free public transit, right? And just like, really expanding our public transit system, making it free and accessible, will really prevent a lot of us from using our cars, which are creating a lot of the pollution. One other thing is think about where we're building housing, right? So when we build new housing, right now it's the conversation is, what can make the most profits, right? They don't really think about things in terms of climate change. But when we build new housing, we have to think about, are these built near places of work? Are these built near schools, right? And this prevents also, that travel time and reduces pollution. The big thing that we need to do, the part of the reason I wanted to run this time as a teacher, as a first time candidate for this assembly seat, and not in 2 years, is because I really believe our state legislature hasn't addressed this with the urgency that it needs. Thinking about transitioning our grid in California, Emily, is no easy task.
Mm.
I mean, we, like you said, we have houses. The oil refineries were here before, so they are such uh, a part of our landscape, unfortunately. And so transitioning our grid is going to take a decade or even maybe more than a decade. We need to do it quick. And so we need to work with the best urban planners, the best environmentalists to really transition, have a just transition so that we can transition to renewable energy. This is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. And especially doing this, making sure that we do this in a way that people don't lose their jobs.
Mm.
I don't want to just close down a refinery, because that's harming workers. I want to make sure we have a plan in place, and this all takes time. And so those are some of kind of the key policy platforms I really want to fight for.
And science teachers for everything. You have like sciencey ideas, but you explain them really well, which is a nice, nice to talk to someone who can do
Thank
that.
you, Emily.
All right, so let's talk about healthcare. This is California. There's a
Yes.
Democratic supermajority in the House
Mhm.
and Senate. It has a Democratic governor.
Right.
What is standing in the way of single payer healthcare in California?
Yeah. And the truth of it is, I'm going to be very honest, and I've been attacked by this, by the way, on my mailers recently, that I can say where the Democratic Party's lacking because,
Mhm.
I love my state, I love my country, and I want to make it better. So a lot of this, the root of the problem is we had a bill in the state legislature, SB 562, if I'm not mistaken. And there wasn't, unfortunately, enough legislative support for it. Different excuses were given. The nurses wanted this bill to pass. Um, to me, what I see and what I see across the board, Emily, is the influence of this pay to play system. If, when I was running for office, I knew I had to raise a lot of money. So what I did was I looked up, a progressive politicians who I thought were progressive and said, let me see where they're getting their funding, right? It seems like common sense. I will go reach out to these people or you know, these companies, but I realized that they were all corporate, and I took a vow not to take any corporate money. And so it was deeply disappointing. And a lot of that is, dialysis companies, you know, um, health insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, these private healthcare industries. And that is a huge influence. We can underscore that. And they are lining the pockets of a lot of our legislators. So I don't want to say it's that, oh, we're going to get there and give that false hope. We'll get there. We can get there, but we have to hold these legislators accountable. We have to limit corporate spending because honestly, they are making their decisions based on what's lining their reelection,
That is
for
a
the next.
perfect transition into my next question,
Perfect.
actually, which is that you've
Perfect.
criticized your opponent, who's a former police officer, for taking
Yes.
tens of thousands of dollars from police unions, despite representing a district that has seen multiple people killed by law enforcement
Hmm.
over this just the summer.
Yes.
So
Yes.
you say a different vision is possible, and what is your vision?
Yes. That is, I mean, I'm so glad you asked that after that because it's the same thing. I mean, if you look at the DA race that's happening now between Jackie Lacey and George Gascon, it's such an important race. And the common thread we're seeing in police reform is the pay to play system again. I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but it is absolutely true that our legislators are concerned about disappointing the police unions and the police packs that are giving them money than serving our black and brown kids. And and it breaks my heart to say, but it's absolutely true. And so, yes, my opponent is I believe the fifth or sixth most in accepting police money. Look, I don't, he is a cop. Okay, I understand he can maybe change his job. That's fine. But you can make a choice to stand for your community versus, legislate on behalf of the police unions and the police packs. That is not justice. I mean, justice is being on the side of the victim, on the side of the community, simply put. And so, one thing that we have to do is, I want to shout out the California Progressive Caucus because they called for all Democratic legislators to denounce this money, and because that is affecting their decisions. We had a great bill. There's a lot of things we can do for police reform. Okay, we had a great bill up there that would have ended qualified immunity, basically, which is what police unions can kind of use. They're very
Mhm.
powerful. They're more powerful than some other unions in terms of protecting their police officers to the point where, you know, body cam footage isn't released sometimes, evident a lot of times, we don't have the adequate evidence released. We have a sheriff in place right now, which is
Y'all
completely
have a
mishandled.
gang in your sheriff's department. Let's just say it.
Yeah, there is a gang. You're right. There is. I mean, yes, there is. And I think that it's the fault of the system we've created in, protecting our police officers at all costs. No
Mhm.
one's saying that they don't want to treat police officers equally. But what we're saying is it is so tipped right now in favor of making sure the police officers not even investigated or tried and evidence isn't released. That's not just. I mean, anyone on the left and right in the middle can argue that that's not a just system. And so we need to make it easier to really lead these investigations, release the evidence, hold folks accountable, just like if someone, were hurt or someone stole something, or, I mean, that person's held accountable. Let's create that type of just system. And so, yeah, it's really important to me that we do that. And one thing I want to bring up is that, I brought up death row. I really think we need to permanently eliminate the death penalty here in California. We haven't yet. We have a moratorium with Gavin Newsom, but when he leaves, it's going to be back. And having folks on death row, having so many folks in prison is actually wasting our state money. So it is cheaper to invest in housing and give folks a home, give them an education. It's actually cheaper, even with our college education now, how expensive it is, than housing a prisoner. So,
Mhm.
for those that are more, on the right or moderate, I mean, if you're concerned about fiscal, and careful spending, it's actually going to save our state money, to do the humane thing, you know.
That sounds like what I hear you saying is stop spending all the money on prisons and go upstream a little bit so that you don't need them.
Right,
If
right,
that's correct.
right.
All right. So last question, hard hitting. I understand that your husband, your partner, is
Mhm.
also a competitive robotics teacher.
Yes.
So I need to know, have you two ever battled robots? And if so, who won?
Oh. This is what, yes. So yeah, my husband's an engineer. He has want to shout out his team, 4201, the Vitruvian bots, who are world champions. They've actually won the world championship, and they're a great team that does a lot of service to help other teams as well. We have actually, funny story, we made it a point when we started, because I'm actually super competitive, more than he is, to not be in a similar competition so that we won't, ruin our marriage.
Fair enough.
Because I mean, I'm very competitive. But we were in a competition once, and it was such a beautiful thing. And I'm sorry if this is not the exciting thing to say, because I love talking about it though. His team does have more privilege. I mean, they acknowledge that they have more funding and all that. They opened up their pit. A pit area is where between the matches, you kind of come and fix your robot. They opened up their pit to share it with us so we could share all their tools. I want to talk about this because this is like warms my heart. This is what we need to create more of in the world. And they, helped us out. We helped them out where we can, but they kind of did the equitable thing. And whenever we needed something, they were there for us. And so I love that. I'm actually remembering that more than the times that we were in that competition and we fought with them. There was a couple of times we were in an alliance with them and that we were against them. I think some matches they won, some we won. But you know what's funny, Emily? I choose to focus, with all this negativity in the world, on the camaraderie that's created in this robotics program. The give and take that's there. I mean, it's just such a beautiful spirit of we call it in robotics gracious professionalism. We call it cooperation. These are words we created. It's competition but cooperating.
Cooperation?
Seriously, it is a word we have, and I want to make this popular because we need more cooperation
I'm
in
stealing that
government.
word. I am stealing cooperation.
Cooperation, you can compete, but you can cooperate, and you can be professional, and you can be gracious, right? So that's the spirit, I remember the most, to be honest, because it just warms my
And
heart.
that sounds like it's also real good for your marriage to engage in cooperation rather than trying to kill each other's robots.
Emily,
I
you've
think
actually brought it up. Ironically, it sounds really, we've been like, we are not cooperating.
that's
Yes.
well, Fatima, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute joy having you on the show. For our viewers, I hope you'll check out Fatima's race. If you're in Los Angeles, election's coming up. Don't mail your ballot, take it in person, and no more time for the mail. And thank you all for joining us on The Briefing. This has been Our Future on the Ballot. We're going to be live again today with me again. If you if you want to keep hanging out with me, 4:00 today, we're going to have another edition of our other show, The Count. And if you haven't voted yet, or if you know someone who hasn't voted yet, please make a plan at www.vote.org. You can also follow The Appeal News on Facebook, The Appeal on Twitter for the latest news, and you can catch most of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts. So I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Take care, and we'll see you